Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, the feasibility of President Trump's immigration policies. A week on the job, and President Donald Trump already started his second term with sweeping executive orders, effectively wiping out many Biden-era immigration policies immediately.
With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense.
Through expedited removals.
All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
The return of strategies from his first term.
We will reinstate my Remain in Mexico policy. I will end the practice of catch and release.
And a promise to conduct the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history. President Trump has made it clear how he intends to slow immigration. But how feasible and likely is it for those policies to actually stay in place and be effective? And what do they mean for southern Arizonans, where some local leaders and law enforcement have promised to not help facilitate mass deportation efforts from the federal government? Lynn Marcus is the founder and director of the University of Arizona's Immigration Law Clinic. She came into our studio to talk with us about what the changes in policy could mean.
Well, so the president cannot amend the Constitution. But what the president has done with his executive order is to reinterpret the Constitution. So he, in the executive order, bars federal offices from recognizing the citizenship of anybody who's born on or after February 20th of 2025 who doesn't have a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, biological mother or father. This includes children of people living and working legally in the United States. So this is an interpretation that's not ever been tested of the 14th Amendment. The purpose of the 14th Amendment was to make it understood that former slaves and their children were recognized as United States citizens, but it was also understood to apply to children of people from other countries. And then the Supreme Court, came out with a ruling to that effect more than 150 years ago, and that's been, the understanding of the interpretation based on the language and based on the legislative history and the understanding at the time. What it says is that if you are born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, then you are a United States citizen. And that carve-out was understood to apply to diplomats, ambassadors, so their children, since they cannot be prosecuted, they're not subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. And the other category was invading soldiers. And this new interpretation is basically saying that if your parents don't have permanent legal status here, then you owe allegiance to some other country and you're not subject to the U.S. jurisdiction. And the weight of legal authority goes against that, and then U.S. history and the statutory history. So it's not expected that the Supreme Court will, endorse this view of the Constitution, but it's queued up. There's 22 states, including Arizona, that sued immediately to protect their citizens.
So the other thing, especially in southern Arizona, that's really getting a lot of attention is that potential for what the president has promised to be the largest mass deportation operation. Is that even possible? What could it look like from a legal standpoint? How would one go about that?
There are estimated to be 11.3 million undocumented people in the United States, unauthorized people. And there are 38,000 detention beds, mostly occupied at this point. So, at this minute, if there were all the personnel necessary, which there aren't, you couldn't round up and house, 11.3 million people, even throughout the course of the 4-year, term of the administration. The law also grants many people the right to bond hearings, and When people bond out and their cases are pending, they go into what's now over 3 million person court backlog. So we have 700 immigration judges. You can increase that number, but not immediately. It takes time to hire people. Those 700 judges managed a record pace of over 900,000 cases last year. And they took in 1.8 million new cases. So you can see the backlog is doing nothing but growing, and it's just going to continue to grow. One of the docket management tools and sort of humanitarian tools at the same time that the Obama administration and the Biden administration did was to set immigration priorities. And what the Trump administration did immediately was to eliminate immigration priorities. So now everybody is a priority, but as a practical matter, it's not possible to detain. You have to increase detention capacity. It takes time. And people have rights in their hearings. They have the right to due process. They have statutory rights. There are defenses. You can defend on the grounds that you're actually a U.S. citizen, which can be very complicated inquiry in some cases. You can defend based on the fact that you were not in fact convicted of such a crime, or it's not a deportable offense, or that you are undocumented but you are entitled to asylum, and numerous other provisions. So the proceedings, can't be super speedy. There's also the question of public backlash. The public was actually distraught with the family separations that took place as part of the policy of the first Trump administration. And here you're talking about family separation again, because you're taking people out of the community into the detention centers and their children, often U.S. citizens. The average undocumented person in this country right now has been here for at least 10 years. So we're not talking, only about people who just got here. So there are many practical hurdles. On the other hand, Trump has invoked on day one many national security provisions, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, to try to avoid due process protections in some cases and get around laws requiring hearings. So he's counting on the tremendous deference that the courts give to presidents when it comes to issues of national security, which is what we saw with the Muslim ban in the first administration, that there was deference because he was talking about, protecting the national security. So really, the Trump administration is pushing the envelope, obviously, is trying new interpretations, trying to be able to use the military, for example, to enforce the laws by saying that this is an invasion, that we are in the process of being invaded, and that therefore he's got powers to be able to get more resources than Congress has authorized for immigration enforcement, for the Department of Homeland Security, and to be able to try to get around the hearings.
And if my memory serves, again, not being an attorney or trained in the law, there are provisions in the Constitution when it comes to the use of the military about the use of the active military, not the National Guard, within the boundaries of the U.S. So that declaration of an invasion could be legally very important also, if my memory serves correctly.
This idea of that we're in an invasion, and so we're basically as if we are fighting a foreign army, that's been used to try to get around a lot of provisions like this, that the U.S. military is not, for example, supposed to be used in domestic law enforcement. But there are going to need to be court hearings in I would say, the vast majority of cases. And certainly all these things that he's trying are going to be challenged. He can avoid court hearings. The administration can, for undocumented people who can't prove that they've been in the United States for at least 2 years, because there's an expedited removal statute that's been on the books since 1997. And it allows that unless a person has been in the United States continuously for at least 2 years and expresses a fear of return or asks to apply for asylum and passes an asylum screening test, if they didn't enter the country legally, they can be removed without a hearing. I don't know that has been fully vetted in terms of court challenges, but it's something that could be immediately and has been immediately implemented.
He's returning his Remain in Mexico policy. For listeners, can you give a bit of background on what that was and what that means as of now?
It started during the first Trump administration in January of 2019. It's non-Mexicans who were seeking to enter the United States to apply for asylum were sent back to Mexico to wait for their hearings there, and there were hearings held in a few places along the border. And when the Biden administration came into power, it deemed the program inhumane, and that's because there were large numbers of violent crimes that were being committed against migrants, and they were being forced to live in squalid conditions and were essentially sitting ducks for the cartels. I mean, we're talking about people being raped, robbed, kidnapped, extorted, tortured, and in some cases killed. So the Biden administration suspended the program, but then Texas and Missouri sued, and there was a district court that forced the Biden administration to actually reinstate the program. So ultimately, the Supreme Court allowed the Biden administration to terminate the program. The Ninth Circuit had also found that it violated U.S. asylum law and international law. I will say, as far as protecting the right to asylum, the program didn't work. A lot of people would say, based on the statistics, there were hardly any migrants who were able to access counsel. There were only 1.2% who won their cases compared to about 32% who were allowed to pursue their claims within the United States, and just a lot of people who were ordered removed in absentia because they were being kidnapped and couldn't get to their hearing, or they had to abandon their hearing, or logistical reasons. So the Trump administration on day one reinstated this program, or I should say announced that it must be reinstated as soon as practicable, but it does depend on cooperation from Mexico. So that time frame is not at all certain.
What is your advice for people who are here without legal status when it comes to the rights that they may or may not have?
People within the United States do have the right to due process. They also have Fourth Amendment rights, so that due process is under the Fifth Amendment. They have rights not to be, for example, strip searched, not to be, beaten up, pushed around. They also have the right to remain silent, actually. I do want to say, in terms of the right to counsel, in removal proceedings, that's at your own expense, or that is at least not at government expense. But nonetheless, there are a number of rights that people have. If you're undocumented and you have U.S. citizen children, what are you going to do if you are apprehended, if you are taken into custody and no one else has a power of attorney, for example, or a guardianship? And so how are you going to manage your property? And so these are things that there are some things that people can plan for and, take steps and prepare documents for. So that is advice that people are giving.
That was Lynn Marcus, the founder and director of UA's Immigration Law Clinic. The state of Arizona and nearly 24 others filed suit in federal court to keep the birthright citizenship change from going into effect. On Thursday, a federal judge temporarily blocked President Trump's order ending the constitutional guarantee of birthright citizenship. You're listening to The Buzz. After the break, we hear from the Consulate of Mexico about how they're planning to meet growing demands.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.
Welcome back to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. We're looking at how President Trump's immigration policies will affect southern Arizonans. Ahead of the Trump inauguration, the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, announced the enhancement of the country's 53 consulates in the U.S., promising to protect and, when necessary, defend Mexican nationals. Rafael Barcelo Durazo is the head of the Consulate of Mexico in Tucson. We talked about what this week has been like for his constituents and what the consulate is doing to support them.
We know that always when there's a change of administration, particularly when there's a change of narrative on public topics such as the immigration or the borderlands that we love so much, we know we're going to be busy because there are so many people that are going to be experiencing unrest. And it's been busy. We have a fantastic leadership in our President Claudia Sheinbaum, the first time that we in the 3 North American countries have elected women. That's long overdue. But I would like to point out about her is, like she said, the priority in our foreign policy is to protect the rights and dignity of the Mexican nationals living abroad and in Mexico, of course. So that, of course, has kept us very busy. Mexico has the most consulates in another country in the United States than any other country in the world. 5 of them are in Arizona. So we have this office in Tucson, Phoenix, and 3 bordering towns, Nogales, Yuma, and Douglas. So, of course, we've been very busy, but particularly, Christopher, let me share with your audience that in Tucson, we operate a nationwide program that is a phone line. It's 24/7 phone line. Every single moment of our life, that center is answering to calls. But that's nationwide. It's not only for people who live in Tucson or around Tucson. So, of course, particularly during the times and with so many announcements regarding the border, immigration, only yesterday we received 1,500 consultations in that center. That's a consular interview that's providing information very important about know your rights. It's very, very important for the people to understand that regardless of their immigration status, they do have constitutional rights where they are. And the U.S. Constitution has so many rights, and it's important for the people to know that because in that way they can exercise those rights.
Is that the number one concern you're hearing? What does this mean for me, regardless of their immigration status? And that's something you mentioned, and it's something the president of Mexico mentioned. Regardless of a person's status in the U.S., those are Mexican citizens. You're going to take care of them.
Absolutely, yes. And something that, many families in the United States of Mexican origin that have individuals of Mexican origin are actually a mixed status families. So you have U.S. citizens with permanent legal residence and then undocumented people in the same family. So of course, like the idea of a likely family separation because of the enforcement of different priorities of deportations is something that of course is concerning our community. But it's also that is being concerning and not only preoccupying but occupying organizations that work to protect the rights of everyone, including migrants. Part of what we do is exactly that. We have to protect, for instance, the due process of the law. That is a constitutional right that every person in the United States have, regardless of what their immigration status, even knowing that you have the right to remain silent if you are detained until you speak to a lawyer and then you can know about your legal situation. That's also very important. Even knowing that you have the right to speak to a lawyer as a right, it is important, and particularly knowing that you have the right to notify consulate or the authority that has you under your custody has the obligation to notify your consulate if you are requesting to have a conversation with a consular officer of your country. So that's very important for Mexican people to know. Anyone, of course, and any foreigner in the United States has the same right as foreigners in Mexico have it in our country. So we're working on that, but I would like to point out the 3 main components of what our president said that we will always have in regard to the U.S. relationship. First, respect of our sovereignties. We understand that the United States have the right to issue their own regulations regarding so many topics. Second one, collaboration. So we know that our main problems, both for Mexico and the United States, are actually intertwined. We have shared problems. So how do you solve a shared problem? With collaboration. You cannot do it thinking that's a Mexican problem or that is a U.S. problem, because it's actually shared problems that we have to come together, not only as government, but also as societies, as economies, to solve them. And the third one is like to defend the dignity of the Mexican people. And that's something that is very important because we are a very proud nation. We know that we have our problems. Every country does. And we face those problems and we want to solve them and we want to live in a fair society. But But that doesn't mean that we don't understand how important it is our culture, how important it is our economy for the North American region, and how important it is that Mexico is the main trading partner of the United States. Every minute, $1.5 million are traded in our share border. That's not only because we are always buying and selling products between the countries, but because we produce together. We produce sophisticated automotive and electronic devices. Sometimes there are products that cross the border 10 times to be produced. And that's why that's the amount, that's the dimension. And that means millions of jobs in the United States, but also in Mexico. For every job that is created in Mexico, when a U.S. company invests in our country, 3 jobs are created in the United States. Because we normally produce more in the manufacture section, but the company has so many other components to it. So that's the size, that's the dimension of our shared economies, our shared societies, in particular our shared families, because we have so many families that belong and feel that belong to the 2 countries.
Having gone through one Trump administration, do you have a level of expectation what the difference could be between the first Trump presidency and the second Trump presidency when it comes to relationship with Mexico?
Yeah, I like to think about it as a siblings relationship. Sometimes you get to quarrel about some things. Of course, if you have to share the bedroom, oh my God, the quarrels that you will have with your siblings. But the fundamental part of your relationship is so deep that you are going to find the ways to resolve the disagreements that you might have. That happened in the first Trump administration, and that is going to happen in the second Trump administration. What I mentioned about our economies, our families, our societies being so integrated is something that will take us that reality is much more stubborn than anybody else. And our reality is that we share so many things. So we need to find the ways to communicate our disagreements. And I think I'm hopeful because President Sheinbaum and President Trump, they have already communicated. They were able to talk on different levels on very important topics that concern us on both sides of the border. And I'm pretty sure that they will find the ways, even when we have different point of views on some topics regarding our share border, regarding our economic production, regarding free trade, we'll be always willing and able to find the ways to cooperate. So security, the immigration topics, which are not exclusive of the U.S. Sometimes I get to see the U.S. media, and apparently they think that migration starts when people arrive in the U.S. border. And you have to understand that migration starts when people leave their community of origin. And Mexico, it is a country of origin of migrants, but it's also a country of destinations of immigrants. It is also a country of transit of millions of migrants across the decades that have crossed through our territory to come to the United States. And it is also a territory of return of immigrants. Those 4 stages of immigration creates a complex situation, and the governments and the societies needs to cope with different situations. But I'm pretty sure, as I mentioned, that the United States and Mexico will be always able and willing to find the ways to cooperate.
Earlier, you mentioned the 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week phone line that is a national phone line that's operated out of the Tucson office. There's also the Consul app for phones, Androids. Talk a little bit about that.
That's another way that the Mexican government has created to make simpler the access to the consular network. It's not only a way because it has a button to contact in case of an emergency, perhaps an imminent detention, or you have another kind of emergency, you can use that button. But I think what is the most important thing about the app is that it will inform you about your main rights, things that you have to consider. Also has very easy way to locate the closest consulate to you. As I mentioned, we are 53 is. So sometimes it's even hard for people to know which one is the one I should go. But also the appointments. As you know, as every citizen in every country in the world knows, having an appointment to have their passport issued sometimes can be a little bit troublesome, or we don't understand the process. We have a fantastic button in the app that will lead you to a WhatsApp chat already that will be automatically take you until you have the appointment. So all of those ways, the app is making easier the access to communicate with the consulates anytime, but particularly now that so many people are concerned about what is going to mean all the migratory changes that the new administration has announced.
That was Rafael Barcelo Durazo, the head of the Mexican consulate in Tucson. We wrap up this episode with AZPM reporters Danielle Camara and Katia Mendoza. Just before the inauguration, they, along with reporter Paula Rodriguez, talked to Southern Arizonans about what issues matter most to them as a new president comes to power. You all participated in the listening session that AZPM did down in Nogales and then up in Saurita, just south of Tucson. What were the main takeaways?
Yeah, so I would say for me, the main takeaway was that Southern Arizona voters really are just an incredibly diverse group of people. And as well, I found that people really didn't fit into sort of traditional party boxes. People really sort of thought outside the box. One example I have is the farmers market in Nogales. I spoke with Maria Martinez. She's a great grandmother. She sells plants at the farmers market in Nogales, Arizona, where she's lived for 50 years. But she's originally from central Mexico, and she's also been a U.S. citizen for 20 years. Her main thing was that she was feeling really hopeful about a second Trump presidency.
Y entonces, ¿qué me estabas diciendo que piensas que va a hacer cambios bonitos? ¿Me puedes explicar eso?
Sí, porque estos años pasados los tuvimos muy difíciles. Muy difícil, la economía estaba muy fuerte y todo está muy caro y tenemos, pues siempre cuando va a entrar algo nuevo tenemos esperanzas de que sea para algo mejor. No más para este país, sino para el mundo entero. Eso es mi esperanza.
So basically what she's saying is that the last few years have been very hard. The economy has been really difficult. Everything is so expensive. And that she just really hopes that this new leadership will lead to something better for the U.S. and for the entire world.
You talked to a lot of people, and I think that first bit of sound you played us may surprise some people considering how close we are to the border. Was immigration a top issue, or were people worried about other things right now?
Pretty much everybody I talked to, I did ask most people if immigration was a topic that concerned them, given that it was such a big part of the campaign and has been such a big part of the first week of Trump's presidency. And while some people said they were concerned about immigration as far as security, everybody agreed that it didn't affect their lives personally. And that was across the board, whether they lived at the border or not, whether they were Latino or not. But I will also say that I did talk to a few immigrants from Mexico who were Trump supporters, and they basically said that they felt like as immigration had become such a big issue, they were worried that people were coming into the country that were not following the same rules that they followed. So that was sort of an issue that was part of what was driving their vote. I have another quote here from Maria Martinez, who I talked to in Nogales, so I'll just let her explain.
Y como te digo, yo lo siento como que es mi país y como si fuese mi casa. Aquí tengo todo, mi esposo, mis hijos, mis nietos, todo lo que yo más amo. Y a mi casa no va a entrar nadie sin que yo lo permita. Solamente que yo dé permiso, solamente que yo estoy de acuerdo y que sigan las reglas.
So basically what she's saying is that she feels like this is her country. This country is like her home. She has everything here, her husband, her children, her grandchildren, and everything she loves. And she says that in her house, no one can enter without her permission and without following the rules.
Katia, what did you hear when it came to immigration and border security and things like that as they came up?
You know, only a handful of people that I spoke with were concerned with that issue. And this is a topic that I spoke with Paola and Danielle, how we agree that with more distance from the border, people become increasingly concerned. And although I was not there, in Nogales, talking at that time, my family is from there. So the lack of concern with border security and immigration, that doesn't necessarily surprise me because I'm familiar with that demographic specifically.
And I've seen this in my reporting that the further we get away, the more we hear about it, which is kind of an interesting thing, which what you all found backs that up. Danielle, were there other things as you were talking to people that you want to share that they were bringing up? And we've talked a lot about border, but it's a big topic.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that there was, just as an example of the diverse views of people in Southern Arizona, there was another person who I talked to who he is an independent. He told me he typically votes Republican, but he did not vote for Trump. And while he, like pretty much everyone I talked to, said immigration and the border doesn't directly affect his own life, he had some different concerns on immigration.
Well, my grandparents and my uncle have a fruit orchard, so they rely on immigration to be able to have their livelihood and run their orchard and things like that. So I probably have a different view than a lot of people. And I feel like as far as the negative stuff with immigration, if you are into drugs and illegal immigration, then yeah, you might experience it. But for the most part, I don't ever see it.
I will say that, just going back to your very first question, as far as takeaways, most people, their number one concern is the economy. And there was another woman who I spoke with in Sahuarita who is an immigrant from Mexico, and she voted for Trump. She was excited about Trump's second term in office. And I also have a quote here from her about her thoughts on how she's concerned about the economy.
La comida, mira cómo está la comida. Antes nunca checábamos los precios de la comida, pero esta mañana mi esposo fue por huevos, una carterita de huevos, $10. So eso es lo que quisiera, eso es lo que me preocupa, y eso es lo que quisiera que se normalizara.
So she basically was just saying that she didn't used to have to check the price of food, and that very morning her husband went to the store to buy eggs and one carton cost $10. So, that is like pretty much the main thing I was hearing a lot, is that people are tired of things costing so much and they wanted a change.
And of course, during the campaign, especially the end, we heard a lot about the price of eggs as an example of where the economy is. And there it was.
That was one item where the price went up very much and everybody buys it and everybody remembers how that hurt. So, yeah.
Katya, in the time you spent out there, was there anything in particular that surprised you that you heard or saw?
Yeah, not necessarily a topic or an issue, but rather who listens to the news. I spoke with two women about middle age, I would describe them, and they said that they don't necessarily follow the news, rather they just kind of rely on what their husband says. And it's naive to assume everyone follows the news and global events and things like that, but it made me really wonder how to view a perspective like that. What can journalists do perhaps to reach more people from many different walks of life?
So when you were talking with people, Katya, especially this week, everybody's talking about immigration. Are people getting tired of the news? Did you hear that news fatigue?
I definitely heard that prior to the inauguration, which is when we reached out to the community. People are tired of listening to politics, and it's definitely the negativity that surrounds certain headlines. I can see why people would feel that way and be more attracted to feel-good family stories and things going on in their community. This isn't new for journalists to listen to or the kind of feedback. It's just a matter of prioritizing perhaps more solutions-oriented articles, reframing how we write headlines, who we're writing for, and kind of circling back to the key takeaways, the first question that you asked us. I think being out in the community, it was a reaffirming experience for me because it's just a good reminder on who we are doing all of this for who we are reporting for and disseminating information. And like, we were just having informal conversations with the community, which is so important because there's the lack of pressure of having to produce something, one, but two, it's like, it is a reminder that we're storytelling. We're just talking to people about what they care about. It's so simple, and people forget that.
All right. Well, Katya Mendoza, Danielle Camara, thanks for spending your weekend out listening to the community at these, and thanks for popping into the studio to chat with us.
Absolutely. Happy to.
Thanks.
That was AZPM reporters Danielle Camara and Katya Mendoza. And that's The Buzz for this week. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Bella Rodriguez is our producer this week, with production help from Maggie Farmer. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
AZPM's original productions are made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org. Thank you.